This is Anagalactic on the 8th day of October, a Tuesday. Most of my effort now is going into completing the LaTeX document to announce a new geometry, so as to complete this phase of a very natural phase of science which always must occur, because science is communication. So what are we communicating to each other? I'd like to begin with our number system. This is how we were taught in school. There are two major fields of study in science which have reached paradoxical limits. And conveniently, we can say that it's the outer product, which translates to spatial infinity, and the inner product, which translates to incomputability. Both of these are major hurdles that have stymied science for over a century. So in presenting this new geometry, it's very important to begin with our number system with its mathematics and our geometric system, which is a little bit incomplete, which is good news. This discovery is good news, but it does require several levels of explanation. So, we do use numbers as tools, and it's important to understand very simply and directly that we use a linear number system. Now, it turns out that there is actually no way to escape the use of the linear number system. It is a given. So it's very important to understand the notion of computability. Well, we're fairly confident now, after centuries of using the linear number system, that it serves its end perfectly. It does. I could begin by the harnessing of electricity, that is due to mathematics. We also got space travel. This is simply another performing art. It's an art of communication, but it's based on strict and rigorous logic. It's not about opinions. There's reasons for models. Never to dictate, never to determine. No, that's up to you. It has to be, or there would never be another discovery. A discoverer does not make a discovery by accident. He tries. What are you trying to find out? That's very important when approaching the quantum paradox and the cosmological paradox. We've reached a paradoxical limit. And my approach is to begin by stating how we do science. This was not my original intention. This is a development that came my way. This geometry is only one of two possible geometries. There are only two geometries known to man. This is actually part of my discovery, because I've never heard this stated accurately. I hope this makes sense to you, and if it doesn't, it will be my fault. So I intend to make this absolutely crystal clear. Just exactly what I discovered. It originated in the study of spheric rotations. So I was studying the sphere. And to make a very long story short, and I have given video presentations on how I came upon this discovery, but it's the discovery of the number system of the sphere. That's very important to emphasize that. And it's also very important to allay some fears, because that is a preposterous thing that I just said. I discovered a new number system for an object that is not fully understood even today, called the sphere. Well, the sphere is such a basic geometric unit that what I said, if it's true, has the potential of being the greatest discovery in the history of mathematics. Okay, so it's nothing less than that. I know that that's what this is, and I intend now to present it as such, for what it is, explaining step by step, so that you can prove it to yourself, so you can prove it to others. That completes the process of science. Insofar as any man has control over it at all. And there is a process where the man does not have control. I am at that phase. where I am now a member of the scientific community, and it's my duty, as I see it, to present this discovery formally so that it can be proved and understood. I have proven it, and now I'm just going to go through the rudiments. That is, taking some pretty swift jumps. There are over 710 videos that I have made already to describe this in full, and it's a good thing that I undertook to enter the YouTube channel area and create a channel, and YouTube has been very generous. At first I was a little rusty and I used some bad language twice, and I got a warning, both of which have been erased, but they stay on your record just to be sure you don't do it again. Because that kind of behavior, and I was wrong, and I admitted it, and I was forgiven. So YouTube is all right in my opinion. I have nothing against YouTube. I know about the rumors, okay? Everybody who does anything on the internet has rumors float. I like YouTube, and I'm very grateful. But it's a good thing that I did start this channel, because all I was presenting at the time were some of the developments that came from this geometry. In other words, I was just explaining the geometry and the number system. So I'm going to start there. That we only have 2 number systems available, and we only have 2 geometries available. Both of those statements could be contested rationally and successfully. Both of those are exaggerations. So you have to understand, this is the cutting edge of science, where things tend to just be a little bit uncertain. And when one is challenging in any way what is considered to be already known, then you'd better be able to prove it. You'd better be able to prove it. But there are 2 contexts. The system that we use currently, which is a geometry number system called linear mathematics. It's the linear number system, which is based on the line. That's why we were taught the number line, because numbers exist on a line. What they do not exist on is a curve. And that's the only other thing. As soon as you're not using a line, you're using a curve. And there's nothing in between. Not in any dimension. So that's a monumental statement, but it's absolutely true. That has been proved. So we're dealing with curvature on its own terms. That's the only other number system. Now that number system has not yet been fully discovered, except by me. That is my discovery. This is an advancement on the complex number system in the sense of 2 componency. I had to check the door, sorry about that. 2 componency is a valid attributive term to the complex number system. But it turns out that part of my discovery is that 2 componency, exactly as it's used in complex number construction, can be composed another way. And it's simpler. It's simpler because it does not use the square root of -1. Now that's just bracketing information to telling you the number system itself. It's whole linear number fractions based on unity. And all that means is that wavelength of 2, for instance, multiplied by its reciprocal, which is called frequency, when you multiply the frequency times the wavelength, they're always reciprocal and multiply to 1. That's redundant. Wavelength and frequency are reciprocal numbers. Well, you may already know that that is the definition of energy. The definition of energy is wavelength times frequency. That is energy. That's energy. So that's extremely basic, is that energy is not a 1-component number system geometry. It's a 2-component number system geometry, but I have never, in all my research, found anyone who has ever said that. Those are 4 whole linear numbers. And they are in this order. Starting with wavelength, you have 1 proportion 2. For the frequency, you have 2 proportion 1. And those are actual numbers that represent physical reality. So those numbers are absolutely correct, but only in their 4-component relationship. It's really 4-element relationship. In this context, element refers to any one of the whole linear. They are whole linear numbers. Okay. And they're composed into 2 reciprocal fractions. One of them is the reciprocal fraction of wavelength. And the reciprocal fraction of wavelength is called frequency. And that is always greater than 1. It's always greater than 1. And it's always a whole number. That's called the quantum principle. It's called quantization. This is the origin of the term quantum. And you now know the correct definition of the quantum. The quantum is the lowest wavelength. Or, I should say, I'm sorry I said that backwards. Although low and high here are relative. It's not really low and high. It's reciprocal and anti-reciprocal. These are 2 fractions composed of whole numbers. And every one of these fractions has the number 1, either in the numerator or the denominator. If it's in the denominator, which is the one on the bottom, we think of 2 over 1 as being the equivalent of the linear number 2. And that, of course, can be proved. So that is the relationship. In part, we need both relationships. What we've just stated is the relationship of the 2 elements of one of the components. I hope that makes sense. There are 2 components, each of which is composed of 2 elements, making 4 elements into 2 fractions, one of which is reciprocal. And you'll notice the geometric positioning here. That's actually true. They're orthogonal numbers. I proved that. I've never heard anybody state that, but it can be proved. I have proved it. So we have a fundamental relationship of the 2 fundamental constants of the universe. Alexander Unziker is exploring this area in extraordinary detail and with great erudition. He's doing a good job. And I'm explaining the solution to Herr Unziker's piecing together of this strange puzzle. This is the solution to the puzzle. It begins at the quantum level. And you have to compose the quantum as a number. Because that's the definition of what is a quantum. A quantum is a linear number. And it's one of 2 linear numbers. It's either the frequency, which begins at 2, which is the first number after 1, going higher. We'll say higher because that's what we're used to saying. But these are not linear numbers. They are equivalent to linear numbers, but they're actually spheric numbers. A linear number only has 1 element. A spheric number has 4 elements, which are composed into 2 components that are reciprocal. And I'll show you now that they're orthogonal. And it's a very interesting sequence that I hope you get. I'll make it as clear as I can, because the only obstacle to understanding this is the ultra clarity of the result, which is surprising. And I hope you're as surprised as I was to learn this relationship, because it explains a lot. So this step that I'm attempting to conduct now for your edification, for you to get this too, is to unite the geometry visually with the number system you just discovered with me. that two numbers multiply to 1 that are reciprocal whole fractions. I'm using the term whole fraction such that 1 over 2 is a whole fraction because the two elements are whole numbers. These are restricted in range to 1 or greater. There is no lower number than 1. Now you would immediately object thinking linearly. But I ask you to just stretch your mind because it's not too important until you see the relationship, and then you'll see it directly. All right, so it's the relationship between wavelength, to which we assign the lowest possible quantum number. That is eternally and for all the universes to come or in the past or around us. That is 2. The universe says that. The lowest number in the linear system that represents anything physical is the number 2. And you may ask, what about 1? We're getting there. But the difference between 1 and 2 is very important to see. And so I'm going to show you how to see the relationship between wavelength and frequency. These are reciprocal numbers that multiply to 1. Okay, what good does that do us? Why is the wavelength-frequency relationship so ultra important? What do I say about that? That is my discovery, so I'm going to state exactly what that significance is. But I have to do so now geometrically so that you'll see it. So now, I want you to turn on your internal blackboard and draw a circle. Now you know that the full moon looks like a circle, but it's actually a sphere. You're going to think of this circle either way you like, because I've proved, both mathematically and geometrically, the exact numeric relator between the circle and its sphere. The circle and its sphere. It's a 2-to-1 relationship. File that. Now you're going to see something that no man has ever seen, except I have. So I hope you get this and enjoy it. In other words, that you see exactly what I saw. I shall endeavor to express it correctly. So pay attention, okay? I'm sorry, but that's just something I felt like saying, because this is very important to me. So you've drawn a circle, okay. What if I told you that that's a closed line? I think you could accept that pretty obviously. A straight line is not closed because it's open at both ends, but a circle has no ends. So it's a closed line. It's the simplest of all the closed lines in any dimension. I proved that, so accept it. I think you understand that's provable. It has been proved. But it's important to state what you're looking at. You're looking at the perfect line. And I'm reusing the word line. And I want you to switch so that you see the circle as a closed line. There is a metric for that closed line that can be composed in 4-element linear numbers, 4-element whole linear numbers. The linear numbers in this system are all whole numbers. They're also called the counting numbers. It's all the numbers except for 0. And there's nothing in between the numbers. That's the quantum principle of the universe. That if you find the lowest number, which we did, Max Planck discovered the lowest number in the universe. In this case, you don't want to think of it as low or high, though. It's just the original counting number is 2. It's not even 1. 1 is the basis number, in the same way that 0 is the basis number of the line. So I hope I didn't confuse you by saying that. Let's turn our attention back to the circle. And you see that I will be referring to a new metric that is not a linear metric, but it uses linear numbers. We cannot avoid linear numbers. They are the numbers. And the only reason that we have a problem with 0, you can treat 0 in such a way that it does not cause a problem. And we've done so. So we know we can get around the problem of 0 being the center, but it is a problem. Now, is there any other center besides 0? Because 0 is actually a fatal problem in trying to compute universal constants. Because universal constants are all two-component numbers. There are no linear constants. There are only two-componency constants. Because the universe is only constant in a force-conservative system. And that will be coming up. You may know that I'm an expert on Ruđer Bošković's most amazing discovery in the history of physics. So I'm able to corroborate his research now, which is a long time coming. For 250 years, Ruđer's work was overlooked. And yet he overcame Newton. And he left Newton and Leibniz in the dust. And we've been suffering under the artificial reign of Newton for a very long time. But what Roger found is that force conservancy, which Emmy Noether proved is a symmetry, is the basis of everything in the universe. It's based on duality. So you do need two numbers, or you can't compose space. We've attempted to do so with a grid. What we're doing now with our circle is showing how the universe begins her numbers. And she begins them with 4 whole linear numbers, 2 of which are unity. And that's the wavelength has unity in it, and the frequency has unity in it. Why? Because all the constants in the universe have unity in them. And that's why we think we can decompose these two-component constants to a linear whole number, or a linear number, not a whole number, but a linear number. We can do so because we think 2 over 1 is equal to 2. We were taught that in school as if it were true. You can see now that that was incredibly naive. Incredibly naive. That 2 over 1 is the same thing as 2. No, it's not. You can reduce it, and that works. So, but that's not saying enough. Why is 2 over 1 considered to be the same as 2 when you can see by looking at it that it's not the same as 2? Because it's the two-componency form of 2. When you have a reciprocal to that, you don't balk at all, because the 1 is in the numerator. And now I want to tell you something about the wavelength and the frequency. Both of those numbers have 1 in them. It's just that one of the 1s is in the denominator. That's the one we call frequency. It's always a whole counting number. That's redundant. It's a whole number greater than 1. Why? Because 1 times 1 doesn't mean anything, and 1 divided by 1 doesn't mean anything. Unless you want to get philosophical. But as soon as you diverge from 1 over 1, you get the universe. So the universe is derived from unity. Physically. It's a physical unity. The universe is a physical unity. There's no null in it anywhere. There is nothing that's empty. The entire universe is one thing. even empty space. Well, really, especially empty space. And when you combine that with energy, you have wavelength and frequency. Energy is measured in frequency, but it's also measured in wavelength. What's the relationship between those two numbers? Unity. Unity and the other number. So what are these in the two components? One of them is wavelength, one of them is frequency, and now I'm going to show it to you geometrically. Look at your circle. How many points are on that circle? Don't try to answer that. That's a leading question. Wait until I'm done. How many points are on that circle? Okay. Are there any? Okay. I'm not answering because I'm setting you up for what may be the greatest surprise of your life, okay? If you're a mathematician or into geometry or physics, you will definitely want to see this with me. So how many points are on the circle? None. We're just saying so. It's just a circle. It has no points. This is non-Euclidean. There are no points. What is there instead? There's a surface. It's the surface called the closed line. Why is it a surface? It's a surface because it has an inside, which directly implies it has an outside. And these are the two sides of the surface. And now for the geometric proof. Put a point on that circle. Can you do it? Yes, put a point on the circle. You could do it on a blackboard. Just imagine that you can do it. Put a point on the circle. What have you done to the circle? Do you know? Did you do anything to the circle? Well, you could say you put a point on it. Can you say anything else? I'm just going to make a suggestion. No. That's 1 over 1, which means nothing. We don't have any reason for doing that. But it is 1 over 1. We're just going to say so. So that's the circle with a point on it. It's 1 over 1. Now remove the point. Now what's the value of the circle? It's still 1 over 1. Because you put a 0 onto the circle. That does not exist. There's no quantization of the circle, except on 4-element 2-componency, which I discovered, and I'm now showing you geometrically. And here comes the mind boggler. When you put a point on the circle, shouldn't you put one at the other end of a diameter? When you put a point on a circle, you could add a requirement if you dare. But it's sustainable. It can be proved that what you do is correct. When you put a point on the circle, it appears in 2 diametric positions. So you've discovered what true positionality is in the quantum paradox. And that's just a brain teaser. You may be starting to see this and how profound it is. If you put a point on the circle, it is the number 2, because that's the lowest counting number after 1. The circle is 1, but it's actually a 4-element 1. When the 4-element 1 splits conjugally, it makes wavelength and frequency. Okay, so what's the lowest frequency? It's 2. And the next frequency is either 3 or 4. We're not positive about that. It may be that it's not 2, 3, 4. It may be 2, 4, 8. It depends, and I've studied this and I do have the answer, but I don't want to confuse you. But I do want to be complete and accurate. 1 over 3 is a problem. And you can find that in John Horton Conway's surreal binary number tree. That on day 3, you don't get 1/3. It splits you could either say geometrically or harmonically. This was his proof of the definition of a linear number, which did not get a Nobel Prize. I cannot say why he did not get a Nobel Prize for that. Well, yes, I could, but that would take too long. So now you have four-element unity splitting into two componency, where the one remains, but it remains on a diagonal. This is called the conjugal relation. It's used to define complexity. So this is a variation of complexity that's simpler, because it's rational numbers. So there are two numbers that exist together called wavelength and frequency that always have the same relationship to unity. They always multiply to 1. If you have wavelength 1 over 4, what's the frequency? You know, it's 4 over 1. And it's important to say that it's 4 over 1, because the unity never goes away. The whole universe is unity. What we're discovering is how unity makes itself into duality. And that may sound philosophical. It's not. It's the very definition of what numbers are. And you're finding step 0 instead of step 1. We got the line, but now we need the sphere. It's remarkable to say that this proof that I'm giving you, it's not done. I'm about to show you the big hit. It's a big lead-in, but I think you see why. I don't want you to not see this. So I don't want to say it too quickly. All right? That's why I'm not hedging. I'm following an extremely rigorous logical course called rational logic to express this to you so that you will have the proof as well as the visualization. All right. So I'm going to leave off that because we're approaching 40 minutes and I don't want to go too long. When you look at the circle and you make a point on it, it's a dual point called a diameter. The 2 points create a diameter. That's the relationship between the 2 points using a line. So those are called antipodal points. So you can't make 1 point on the circle because the circle is unity. So you're breaking the unity of the universe. You can think of this circle as representing the universe in some way. And it's based on frequency and wavelength. And the frequency is 2. And so now you have 2 points on the circle. Now look at it. How many points are on the circle? It's the frequency number of points. There are 2 points. That's 2 over 1. There are 2 points over the circle. You could say on it or in it. But mathematically, you could extend the use of the word over. So now there are 2 points. They cannot be either one of them called 1, but they have a relationship to another number. That's 1 over 2, so where is it? Do you see it? I think you do. Since it's the wavelength, you might guess that it's the length of one of the arcs, of which there are 2, but their length is the reciprocal of 2. Correct? I hope you start to see this. We're going to go harmonically. We could use the number 3 to make a triangle, but 1 over 3 actually presents a problem. It's not a computable number. So we're just going to leave it out for now until I show you the proof of whether it goes from 2 to 3 to 4 or goes 2 to 4 to 8 geometrically. You might try to guess, but don't. It's not important at this level. But it is consistent. So the 2, we're going to call it the 2. It's frequency 2. Now you know it's frequency 2 over 1. But this is the circle. We're just going to say that that represents the frequency, which is a linearizable, that is, it's a computable number. That's extremely important. That's why I made the comment about 1 over 3. We're just going to go harmonically so that the reciprocal numbers never produce an irrational number. You're not allowed to use irrational numbers in this system. Accept that for now. We'll deal with rationality in just a moment, but this is rational. The question is, can we allow in the irrational numbers? And 1 over 3 is an incomputable number. For our purposes, that means it's irrational. If the universe uses it, then we need to explore that, but we don't need to assert it. It's much more likely, I'll just say, from your perspective at this point, that it actually goes 2, 4, 8, 16 powers of 2. And that makes this system fully consistent, at least to set up what you might call a mock-up. We're trying to get somewhere. Are we getting somewhere? Well, we found out that the circle has frequency relationship with wavelength built into it. So put 4 dots, okay? So now you have 2 pairs of antipodes. There are 4 equally spaced points. We're just calling them points as markers. No geometric interpretation yet. No, the interpretation is the relationship. So you have 4 equally spaced frequency points. That makes frequency 4. That means the wavelength is the arc. It's the arc length of the evenly divided segments. So that's the relationship between 1 over 4 and frequency 4. So you have frequency 4, wavelength anti-4. This can be written in power that is exponential notation so that it exactly matches the linear plus-minus polarity system. But it's the exponent that's plus and minus. So that 2 to the 1 is frequency. 2 to the negative 1 translates to 1 over 2. So it's 2 negative 1 times 2 positive 1 as exponential expressions. So there's your plus minus. It's not in the numbers themselves. They're always positive. We don't have negative numbers in this system. We don't have 0, and we don't have negative numbers in linear terms. But we do have a spherical 0, it's 1, that's the center. And we do have a spherical 1, it's 2, but it's split because it's conjugal, not polaric. And you see that on the circle, don't you? Yes, you do. Look again. Put 8 dots. What's the wavelength? It's 1 over 8. So you know how to write that. It's 2 to the negative 3. And the frequency is 2 to the positive 3. So if you just leave out the 2, you could abbreviate it and just say it's the plus 1 and minus 1. But the plus minus are now orthogonal. And I'll prove that to you. But in order to do so, we have to switch from the circle to the sphere. What you just discovered is the location of time in geometric space, because frequency is time. That is time. Frequency is time. You might ask, what is wavelength? It's contraspace. So that will be true, but you don't know that yet. I'm just telling you what those are. That's the circle. That's called the eigen of the sphere. Every sphere is defined on an eigencircle because all spheres rotate, and that's the equator. So what you just discovered is the energy component of a spherical surface that's measured on the line of angular momentum, which is a closed line, which is why it's angular. You just discovered the angularity. That's the wavelength. The wavelength is the angularity of temporality, because it's an invisible space. All of this is taking place in non-visible space. This is the quantum that we're describing. You'll see that we're actually describing the quantum. It is a spheric thing. And now we'll prove that. So we have a full definition of circular space, redefining the plane so that it's not squared anymore, because we've integrated the squareness into its true nature, fully mathematically and geometrically consistent with how we overlay space with a grid. This is the exact same space overlaid with a circle, which is then the center of the system. And what's inside are the numbers less than 1, and the numbers outside are greater than 1, which in exponential notation can be expressed as a straight line from the center of the universe to the edge of the universe. That's a straight line. But the negative numbers are not opposite of the whole numbers. I should say the negative numbers are not opposite of the positive numbers. What's outside is positive by definition. But what's inside is something a little bit different than space. It's actually imaginary space in the technical meaning of imaginary. That's why the quantum is so difficult to understand. Because the quantum is that sphere inside of which our conception of distance is no longer valid. Distance shifts from a polar positive, which is distance from 0. It shifts so that the relationship between the positive and negative numbers is in power space, which is neatly defined on the exponent as being the exact same thing as a straight line of distance, except it's not distance. It has distance in it, and it also has time. And those are the two numbers, essentially. It's distance over time. Well, that's not on a line. That's on the surface. I should say, that describes a circular space, where the center of the system is the surface, because it has an interior and an exterior. And you see we're driving at a definition of universal space based on our straight line visual system, where the negative numbers contract instead of expand. The numbers going out are whole numbers greater than 1, 2, 4. That is, you could say, if you're using the exponent, the first counting number is 1. But it's an exponent of 2. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. And now it does harmonize. So it's the exact equivalent of the plus-minus linear system in terms of the straight line from the center to the edge. But the straight line from the center to the edge crosses a boundary of 1. So what ordinarily we would call 0 is actually 1 that splits universal space to inner and outer space. Well, I think you can guess that the innermost sphere is the quantum, and the outermost sphere is the universe. But neither one can be penetrated, and for two different reasons. So to complete our proof, we now switch to spheric space, and now you can see that the straight line, which defines the radius of a circle, is all of those lines because it dials around. Well, on the sphere, that's merely the equator of energy, and this is the definition of energy correctly. So now we have energy as a circle, but we know it's actually spherical. Why? Because the universe is spherical. And it was at one time conjectured that the atom might be a planetary system, which would be a linearized sphere, which is called a circle. Our solar system is a circle. It's not a sphere, it's a circle. That is, the planets form a circle, not a sphere. So it was considered to be likely that the atom might be like a planetary system that's a series of circles around a sphere. the center has to be spherical. And that turns out to be correct. Physics has proved that the proton is a perfect sphere. It would have to be, so that's tautological, but to be able to prove it is a big step in science, so we know what the quantum is, it's a sphere. Well, why do we have a quantum length then? It's the radius of that sphere. But what went unnoticed by anybody is that's an imaginary radius. Okay? From the linear perspective it is. The actual relationship going from the circular surface to the center, it's contracting down to the smallest number. That's called Zeno's paradox because it never reaches zero. That's true. Zeno was right. It never does reach zero. Why? Zero is imaginary. You can't use it. You can't reach it. It technically does not exist. It turns out it has to exist, but that gets into something I need to introduce separately. So to continue the proof, here's another major insight. The first one is that you now know that frequency and wavelength define a new number system that parameterizes the plane as a circle instead of as squares. So they're concentric rings, and those are equivalent to the squares. So instead of it being squared, the squared plane, which is squares, it's concentric circles. And that equally fills space, but with an interesting twist. That there is no center that we would call zero. You can prove that it does exist, but that takes us a little afield. The number system itself does not have zero in it. But when you linearize it, which you must do at the end to get your computable numbers back on a translator that I discovered, it's very simple. It's called the calculus. And that's the only use of the calculus, another major discovery. But to complete this, you see that there is what we would call a radius is what Euclid would call a line. But on the circle, it's not a Euclidean radius. It's the radius, but it's not a straight line. But isn't it? I mean, this is the hybrid mind-bending switch. So I think if anyone were going to get hung up on this, it's the difference between one line drawn to the surface of a sphere, for instance, is obviously not the only line you could draw. But what if you could express the entirety of the lines going to the surface? That's really called the ball. It's called the volume. Well, what you could say alternatively is all those lines fill the sphere with one line. So that's one line because they're all the same. They're just pointing in different directions. But a force doesn't really respect that. There's a principle of sphericity that makes the sphere geometrically uniform, such that you should no longer talk about a linear radius to the sphere. It's actually a force line, and that's a term from physics. That perfectly, and at least analogizes, what the radius really is. It's the pressure, which is a number. It's called the integral of the radius. That's the technical name for it. It can be done using calculus. And the relationship between that radius and the surface is 2 tau. And it's tau for the equator. Tau is 2 pi. So that's the translator, and that does require the calculus because, as you know, pi is a transcendental number. I know it's irrational, but I believe it's also transcendental, which is a technical distinction. We cannot allow irrational numbers. But we must in order to get our linear numbers back because they're the computable numbers. So we are forced to deal with tau, but only on the last step. Because we don't know how to compute spheric numbers, except by translating them back to linear numbers. The same is true of the complex numbers, which are used exclusively in cutting-edge physics now. The real numbers are merely a subset of the complex numbers. This is super rationalized complexity so that it's much simpler. It's the same relationship on 4 elements. But instead of 2 of the elements being imaginary, they're unity. So the sphere has this line which represents the force line from the center to the surface. And that's a number, but it's imaginary. Accept that for the moment. But it's not a linear number. The linear radius would be what's called the I'm trying to choose the right word. The number that we're composing to redefine the line in spheric space as the radius of the sphere, that's a 2-component number. But any one of those would be a 1-component number. It's the derivative. So the linear radius is the derivative of the spheric radius. I proved that in 2024, just this year. So this has really been quite a journey for your little professor here. I hope you enjoyed that. We've come up on an hour and I'm literally pouring sweat. This is the last 100-degree day of the year, as I began by saying, because it's significant, because it's over. Tomorrow it's going to be only in the high 90s. Actually, I think the mid-90s, which is a tremendous relief. So I hope you enjoyed this, but here's the capper to close this off so you get the solution. The true orthogonality of the 2 numbers, frequency and wavelength, which occur on a sphere, which we would measure as the eigencircle. And that's consistent, except that for now I need to get to the closure. That force line is going out, right? But it stops at the surface. That's the definition of the radius. So the spherical radius goes out and stops, right? At unity, and that's, you're measuring that distance, spherical distance, which has no real concept of direction, except there is in or out. We're just going to say that we're measuring it from the center to the edge. That's going out, right? All right. So that's one of the 2 components in spherical space, is that number. Well, what's the other one? It's the one that's perpendicular to it. Can you guess what that is? If you can, you're a genius beyond Einstein, Feynman, and everybody else. But I'll tell you the answer that came to me, and it's provably correct. The spheric surface itself, the sphere, defined as that surface, that's the correct definition of a sphere. That is perpendicular to the radius, which is actually the integral radius. That's the force. That's called, in one context, centrifugal force, if it's going out, pushing out from, it's going from in to out. That's centrifugal direction. The opposite is gravity, centripetal force. And they meet at light speed. They meet at 1. That sphere has the value 1. The eigencircle also has the value 1. And that can be proved to be consistent. There are 2 different forms of 1. So we have 3 different forms of 1 now. The linear radius, the circular radius, and the spherical radius. In the case of the sphere, which is the largest volume of those measurements, in that case, it's universal force, and Ruđer Bošković proved that there is an exact relationship between those that defines the strong force and the electromagnetic relationship. Thanks for tuning in. I have to get some water, and we'll be right back with more. I'm almost done with the LaTeX document, the first part, and I'll publish it as soon as it's done. I expect within a week. In 1 week, I'll be 70 years old. I'm having the time of my life. I hope I've been able to to give you something good. That's the reason I'm doing this. That's why we do science. So keep looking up. We'll be right back.